today we are joined with Michaela Daystar of HeartScapes. We're super excited to have her on the call today because she's going to talk to us all about trauma-informed practices. And this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And also, I don't think it's really known amongst the Reiki community. And so it makes it such a vitally important topic to bring to our awareness. And so welcome, Michaela. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. I'm really excited to be here.
Absolutely. So will you start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this point? Like, I know you're like a master gardener down in California, soaking up those sun rays and having a really beautiful Reiki practice, but tell me a little bit more about how your practice came to be and what got you into really educating others around trauma-informed practices and really what that is. Like, there's so much to uncover in this conversation.
Right. Yeah. Well, thinking about like what are the key moments in that journey, right? Because we could probably each talk for hours about, how we came to be working with Reiki as a collaborator, as a friend. I would say in brief that my relationship with Reiki came out of my own personal crises and kind of time of falling apart and putting myself back together due to various life circumstances. And there were several practices during that time that really, caught my attention and pulled me in their direction, having never heard of them before. Reiki was one of them, and Soul Collage was the other. There were many others that supported me during that time, but those were the two that really stayed with me. And I think for many people, I hear some version of this sentiment that, the thing that helps me get through that kind of time is that what I want to then share with other people. And I would say that when I first started my, practicing Reiki, primarily for other people, less for myself initially, about 8 years ago, it was a very externalized focus. It was like, if I can help other people, to get well and to get, balanced and feel healed and centered and whatever they need, then I will feel better. And that was a very generous sentiment, but not one that really allowed me to develop the kind of relationship with Reiki that ultimately I wanted. And so that eventually led me to really reinvestigate my relationship with Reiki, refocus my practice, learn much more about the Japanese origins of the system, kind of come more into alignment with those origins in a way that felt in good integrity to me, and really refocus on my personal practice. In addition to, ultimately building my practice out for others, which is, now my work in the world. But there was this transition period where I really was uncertain if I should be doing this practice out with other people. And a couple of reasons for that. One was, again, not feeling like I understood enough about where Reiki came from, what it is, what it meant to the people who developed it and to the culture and the history at the time, just not having that part of my early education and feeling that I wasn't quite in good integrity around that. So I knew I needed to solve that. But the other piece was that I was starting to have experiences when I was working with other folks that I would later come to understand were experiences around triggering trauma. And there wasn't anything in my education, again, that helped me understand that and help me put into context some of the experiences that I was having, both with clients, but also with myself, with my own kind of internal stuff getting activated in ways that I didn't understand. And there was the perspective that often came back to me when I would ask questions around that was that, well, Reiki can cause no harm. And so anything that's happening that you're experiencing or other people are experiencing is just part of their healing journey, and don't worry about it. And ultimately that didn't feel satisfying. It didn't feel like, it felt like there was some missing pieces. There was some missing understanding. There were some missing things that actually really wanted to come into practice, into active practice. And luckily through, the way we follow breadcrumbs on our path, I did ultimately have the opportunity to be trained in trauma-informed work in other realms, and ultimately decided to actively and intentionally bring that into my Reiki practice. So
I love it. I love it. I love that We all have our own stories that bring us to Reiki. And so often it is that trauma and turmoil that brings us forward. But I love how your journey brought you to like, let's understand this deeper. I want to be in integrity with the culture and the practice, as well as learning how to integrate and help people really shift in their processing beyond Reiki can do no harm. We hear that all the time. And I would love to kind of dig in a little deeper.
Yeah.
Because I mean, this is why I ended up becoming a coach also, so that I could then do like, let's go for the limiting beliefs. Let's find the internal trauma. Where did it reside? How can we bring it to the surface? How can we heal that part of ourselves? So then the clients aren't coming back every single week or every single month with the same issues over and over and over again, because
Yeah.
they haven't gone deep enough.
Yeah. Yeah, Christine, you're bringing up a couple of different layers of this, and I know a minute ago you asked, for some context around what is trauma and what does it mean to be trauma informed. So I'd love to just start there and then kind of address some of these pieces, because I love the way that you combine coaching with Reiki so that you have another layer of expertise, another set of tools that you can layer on top of Reiki. If Reiki is the primary thing we do, however, then we're not coaches, we're not therapists, we're not, actively necessarily, prepared to walk a person through a trauma healing process, but we are part of the support, right? We're part of the landscape of their healing journey. And so it really is supportive for us and for them to understand a bit about that landscape.
Yeah. So yeah, let's definitely look at it as a complementary therapist from that angle for sure. Because I think most people aren't coaches at the same time, Yeah.
Exactly.
So absolutely.
And, and there's so many different things that can be so beautifully combined with Reiki. And at times those things do provide additional layers of training that help us to do more than just offering Reiki. But if we kind of focus it into, a person who's primarily a Reiki practitioner, so first off, when I talk about trauma, what I'm talking about is the ways in which, as we move through life, most of us will have difficult experiences, frightening experiences, painful experiences, experiences that we can't, get out of easily and that don't necessarily just move through our system right away. And what we are now understanding more and more through, really amazing research that's come out in the last 20 years around how trauma works inside of the brain, it's gone so far beyond what we originally understood, which was, that only something hugely dramatic, like war, for example, would cause somebody to be walking through life carrying trauma. So the original designation of PTSD came out of, working with veterans. We now understand that there are many things that we can experience on a day-to-day basis that leave a little imprint in some way in our system. And that embodiment practices like Reiki, like yoga, like martial arts, like meditation can help to move that stuck place out of our physiological body. And I'm not going to geek off about the physiology of trauma in this moment, unless you want me to. But, it's really fascinating when we really look at, how, what is the mechanism to move from, I had a frightening experience, it ended, but there's still some piece of it that I'm carrying. And that piece of it can get activated if there's something that happens in my day-to-day life that somehow reminds my system of that experience. And that fight or flight or freeze or fawn response can kick in. And all of a sudden I'm responding to something that's happening that's unrelated to the traumatic experience as if it was that experience. And this can happen in ways that are conscious, ways that are dramatic, but it can also happen in very small and subtle ways. It can be just a nagging fear that pops up. It can be an aversion that happens. It can be a freezing up or all of a sudden an inability to make good decisions and we don't quite understand why. So there's a lot of different ways that we can have that response.
Would that be your definition of what a trigger is? Because I also see that term kind of being thrown around. Yeah. And what you just described to me is a trigger response.
Right. Yeah. So trigger, I try to pull the definition that I've used from particular clinical studies in my teaching, but to paraphrase it, trigger is something that happens kind of outside of our personal control. And that can be anything from a scent that happens in the space, something that a person says, an image, generally something having to do with our senses. We sense something, we see it, we hear it, we smell it, we think it, we taste it. That somehow connects back to that traumatic experience. And because we're not in control of that sensory experience that we just had, it touches that place in our brain, that place in our body that's still holding that trauma. And all of a sudden we're feeling some of the emotions of that past experience that's unrelated to what's happening. And when we think about it that way, that it's, triggers are things that stimulate our senses in some way. Of course, that can happen in any context, including a Reiki session. So for example, if we're using scented oils in a Reiki session, and say we use a cedar oil, and say somebody has a past sexual trauma, and the person who perpetrated that was wearing a cologne that smelled of cedar. So now all of a sudden that scent that is associated with that harm from my past is in my space when I'm in a healing session. And there's all kinds of things that can happen inside when we have that experience.
I love how you're kind of already helping our listeners connect the dots between what does this have to do with our actual session. So can you give us some other examples? So that was a brilliant one. Like we use, oftentimes Reiki practitioners use essential oils, but it can also be whether the door is left open or the door is closed, or what are some other possible, like, we need to be aware as Reiki practitioners of how we move through the session.
Yeah, absolutely. And essentially what you just said, how do we move through the session in a way that is trauma informed, is really, at the heart of cultivating a trauma informed Reiki practice, which is, what I'm teaching folks. And really what it is about is, first of all, understanding that many people carry some form of trauma, whether it's small, whether it's big, that's normal. That shouldn't be pathologized or seen as something odd. That inevitably means that some percentage of the people who come to us for Reiki session are in that category. We ourselves may be in that category. And that we don't know. And we have no way of knowing unless a person discloses that information to us and gives us specific information about what would or would not be supportive. We do not know what might bring forward unpleasant, uncomfortable, or painful feelings for them. And I don't say that to frighten us, right? Because there's a certain way in which that can feel a little bit halting, like, oh, well, if I don't know, then, how can I even just hold Reiki sessions, right? Or should I just ignore that fact because that's too difficult? Or do I need to, stop? What do I need to do? Mm-hmm. And what I want to say is that this is something that can feel heavy, but on the other hand, there are simple, accessible, elegant ways in which we can structure our sessions the same every time, that offer our clients a reasonable measure. We can never guarantee, but a reasonable measure of safety. We can offer them choice and always the opportunity to consent to what they're experiencing so that they feel in control of their experience. That's really the key for avoiding triggering trauma. Does a person feel in control of their own personal experience? Because in that moment of the trauma, they were not in control, right?
Right.
And so to your question of examples, first of all, that looks like really taking a moment to assess and to just acknowledge that what feels good to me, number one, is probably how I've structured my sessions, but that won't necessarily feel good to everyone. So there's a little bit of, there's a lot of personal work that begins with it, right? And part of that is letting go of the attachment to controlling everything about the experience so that we can give over a little bit more control to them. A really easy place to start is around the topic of touch. Touch in a Reiki session is, on the one hand, part of what's lovely about it, right? Having an opportunity to, feel safe and relaxed and receive consensual, non-sexual touch in a way that's, respectful and loving is part of what's wonderful about a Reiki session. We also know that Reiki can be shared without touch, that it's not necessary for the experience of being in a space of Reiki with another person. We also know that touch is a known trigger for trauma, potentially for certain people. And so it's a very simple and easy thing to shift our mindset from either I'm always going to touch, that's just the default. If somebody's coming to me, they want that. Shift away from that mindset to touch is an option. Reiki can be shared equally well with or without touch. And I will always ask for consent before I touch somebody. Right. And then we just build that into how we introduce people to the session. Right. Reiki can be shared with or without touch. Either way is perfectly normal and good. Which would be supportive for you today?
I get goosebumps because I feel like that is so crucially important for people who have trauma, especially bodily trauma, that just asking to touch them is so important. And I don't often see that explained or communicated in our Reiki trainings. And so thank you so much for bringing that up and bringing that to our attention, because I mean, for years I've taught people, like, don't touch the throat. Like, even if they're okay with touch, don't touch the throat. Like, that's going to be triggering this lifetime or a past lifetime. You just do the back of the neck. It's the same type of honoring what their past could hold. And also, it's okay to have the dialogue with someone being like, would you like the door open or would you like the door shut? Would you like a light touch or would you like me to refrain? Or just giving the option of, at any point, if you're not feeling comfortable, let me know and we can shift over to a no touch session.
Exactly. And that's a really key one, is that people also need to be affirmed multiple times, because our instinct is to defer to the expert. Right. And so one of those other mindset pieces is that I might have expertise and skills and knowledge, and I've created a space that people can come to, but I'm not the expert of that person's experience. They are the expert of their experience, and they're the expert of their healing. And any healing that happens in the session is their system taking on that work. I'm only holding a space for it. So firstly, affirming that for people, which is a mindset shift for them as well. And I can't tell you how many times just that piece alone has made a person step into their power and their agency more strongly when they were affirmed that they're actually the ones that are in control of the session, energetically, spiritually, but also logistically. So if at any time you change your mind, let me know. It's not a problem. If you want to make any adjustment, you want to change your position, you want to share something, you want to make a sound, you want to stop altogether, always, that is not an interruption. It's part of our collaboration. And to say that multiple times, because again, our instinct is going to be to defer to the person who's in charge of the session.
Yeah. What do you think about giving, like, verbalizing permission to also express any form of emotion?
Yeah, absolutely. Letting a person know that emotion can come up, which is not always something that people consider when they come to a Reiki session. Just depends on what their experience, their knowledge of, what happens. So it might not have occurred to them that a Reiki session can be emotionally stimulating. And so again, affirming that that's normal, that they're welcome to share that, and that can come in, various forms. Sometimes that comes in forms that make us feel a little bit uneasy. I've had people want to, really yell or move or, push on something or, really sob. And so again, back to that personal work being the first element of a trauma-informed Reiki practice, there's 10 elements that I go through. The first one is being in our own self-practice. And that includes, again, these shifting mindsets. It includes preparing ourselves to hold space for something that might feel uncomfortable, right? Being very grounded, being very centered in our own practice. And so that we can kind of stay stable, if things were to happen that feel a little bit outside of comfort. And then the other piece of that is to know our own boundaries, to know our own limits. So we talked a little bit about, you have training as a coach, and so you can bring certain elements into a session that are outside of the scope of Reiki. If we don't have that kind of training, as a therapist, as a counselor, as a social worker, as, a coach, then we are not those things, right? And there could be, a point at which somebody is really expressing needs that we're actually not fit
qualified for.
Right. We're just not qualified for. Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can become apparent in mid-session, right? So then what do we do, right? And so part of it again is to have just enough understanding of what happens in a trauma response and enough tools to just help a person stabilize in that moment so that then we can talk about what might be some next steps for them.
Yes. Yeah. I'm constantly reminding my students of like really understanding what our scope of practice is, and really understanding that it is okay to refer out to a counselor. It's okay to refer out to a chiropractor or whoever those other practitioners that might need to be involved on their healing team. And I think that's always needs to be reminded. We're not there to be their friend. We're not there to necessarily be like, if they're word vomiting, that's not really our place as a Reiki practitioner to hold space for that necessarily. And so we have to kind of really walk that line of going, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counselor, I'm not a licensed psychiatrist, and therefore this is outside of my scope. And
Yes.
so how would you go around those conversations? Because I think a lot of people have a hard time going, okay, things are coming up and now what?
Right. No, I think that's really true. And I definitely can relate to that experience. And I know for me, the trajectory went from, when I first started and was again immediately focused on sharing Reiki with other people, instead of what I now, teach, which is that we really need to start with our self-practice, right? Like we really need to be centered in our relationship with Reiki and grounded in our, in our own self before we're actively sharing with other people outside of friends and family and, casual context. But particularly if we're talking about a professional context, we need to be centered in our own practice. And because I didn't take good care of that, I overstepped. I wanted to know the stories. I wanted to be a good listener. I felt like I needed the information, right? I felt like I needed them to tell me X, Y, Z, A, B, C is what's wrong so that I would know how to treat it as if I was a doctor. And, so much of that in my personal experience, and not speaking for other people, but for me, so much of that came from lack of confidence and lack of understanding of how, what is actually occurring inside of a Reiki session. My understanding of what's even happening inside of a Reiki session is so different than it was from then. And so, there was this period of time where I really was eliciting people's stories and information much more than was necessary or, even appropriate. And not that, like making people share things they don't want to, but just, really overemphasizing understanding the words, right? The
Right.
details of their story. And so as I've matured and that's shifted, now as part of my, opening invitation to them, I share that I don't actually need to know anything about what's going on for you, because what we're going to do is hold a space for your system to do the work it's already doing. It already knows how to do. It's actively in process right now. And we're going to put some space around that so that that can happen. If there's anything you want to share, to just help put some context, set an intention for yourself, you're welcome to do that, but I don't need that information. Usually, in most instances, that will elicit a little bit of information, right? Enough, a good amount so that they have felt that they've expressed why they're there. And I've had a chance to listen and hold space, and we've kind of settled into a little bit of trust, because that's part of the trust building, in the beginning of the, can I tell you a bit of my story? Can you hold it? Right? Can we have a bit of an exchange?
That rapport.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then in instances where the person is kind of settling into like a long haul story, right? Like you can kind of feel it, like this person is going to overshare potentially for the context of what we're doing here. Then I've just kind of, cultivated the ability to redirect that, to gently, indicate that that's a great, this is a great place for us to step into the session, right? Like,
Yes.
it's awesome. Thank you for sharing that context. This is a great place for us to step into the session.
Yeah.
Bring us back on track to why we're here.
Yes, because you can definitely tell there are some clients that just want to come in and then tell all of the things. And it's like, I've just started telling people, we have a few minutes for you to share, like give them a time frame, because then they have a boundary. And
Yep.
they know that, we want to do, the primary purpose of this time together is to do the actual work of Reiki. And therefore, I mean, again, it's like, I don't need to know anything.
Right. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then
Mhm.
the same is true on the back end, right? Because, similar in that space of lack of maturity and confidence in my practice, I would also want to know everything that happened for them in the session. And I would want to tell them everything that happened for me. And I would want to make a lot of meaning of that, right? I was feeling this when I was working at your left knee. And so that must mean this. And so I'm going to diagnose that and I'm going to make meaning. And I saw an image of a such and such, and this is what that means, right? It was like this need to like provide expert advice that was, again, outside of the scope of why I was there. So that was something that also softened. And people often ask, right, what did you experience, or what can you tell me about my situation based on this session? And now it's I'll share what I experienced, and I'll say I am not going to make any meaning of that, because the meaning, if there's any meaning, is for you to make. This is what I experienced. You're welcome to share anything that you experience. You don't have to.
Yeah.
And so again, just holding lightly and holding them as the expert of their experience, holding them as the keeper of their experience, right? But sometimes people feel pressured to share when they don't want to,
Right.
right? When they want to, or they don't have words,
Mhm.
And so again, the more we can redirect them back to their own expertise, the more safe and contained and appropriate the session's going to feel for them.
Absolutely. I've seen some practices where they have client journals, where they come into the practice, they journal, they write their intention, they come in for the session, there's no talking. And then at the end, it's the same thing. They can journal, they can process, and they can do it in a waiting room type setting so that they're doing the processing, but it doesn't necessarily need to be with a practitioner.
I love that. That's an excellent process. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
All right. So I know that you have a trauma informed class coming up. Can you tell us what that entails, what students get out of it, how it can benefit their practices, all of the juiciness? I want to know, because I'm like, all right, I've got a list of students I'm going to be sending.
Oh, awesome. I love it. Yeah. So, the class came out of, combination of, again, my own training in trauma informed teaching in the context of a women's leadership development program that I volunteer taught for a long time. And then learning that the areas of yoga in particular, and more recently, mindfulness meditation, has done a lot of work in developing a trauma-informed curriculum. Like, how do you make a yoga practice, a meditation practice, trauma-informed for your clients? Tremendous work has been done in those realms. It's now much more normalized, particularly in yoga. And there's also much more understanding of the way in which yoga can positively impact the process of unpacking trauma, and that yoga can trigger trauma because of the physicality of it. So so much good work has already been codified and turned into curriculum in those realms. I've taken a number of classes from that perspective. And then recognizing that as Reiki practitioners, we don't have something like that for us that's specifically tailored to how we operate and what happens inside of our sessions. And so I, over the years, had been incorporating those lenses into my own practice and realized that we needed something a little bit more formal. At least I did. And I felt like others could potentially benefit. And so it was about a year-long process of taking, pretty in-depth study of the physiology of trauma, firstly, the practices already developed in the realm of yoga and mindfulness meditation, and then translating that into the context of a Reiki practice, really specifically asking myself, how would this look in a Reiki session, in a Reiki class? How can we apply these principles and mindsets to our own context? So out of that came, as I said before, a series of 10 elements that I've identified as being part of a trauma-informed Reiki practice. And so the class walks us through those 10 elements. I wrote a 77-page book, a guide to walk us through those. So we use that as a structure. And it's a combination of talking about those elements, teaching to them, doing some partner work, some self-reflective journaling, some storytelling, and really, bringing out what people's experiences have been. And what I found is that so many of us, like I did, have had these experiences that ultimately we can understand as being some kind of interaction with trauma, either our own or somebody else's, that we didn't have any context to understand. And I really want that to be different for us. I really want us to understand these things on both a physiological level and on a spiritual level. I want us to understand why the phrase Reiki can cause no harm is much more complex than it seems on the surface. So one of the things we go over is this concept that Reiki as an energy, as a phenomenon in the world, as the stuff that makes us up, that animates us and connects us, that can cause no harm because it just is what we are. It's life. But Reiki, if we're using the word Reiki to refer to a system of practice developed by people and enacted by people on other people, any system of practice enacted by people on other people has the potential for there to be harm caused, right? In a number of ways. And so, we look at, for each of the 10 elements, we look at a mindset shift that we might need to make around that element, and then practices we can actively incorporate into our Reiki sessions. And we walk through that over the course of a day. We work in a lot of community around that. And then there's some follow-up support that is available for folks if they want it.
Beautiful. Can you give us kind of a sampler of some of your top 10 of the topics, those elements? Because I'd love to have an idea of what all is included.
Yeah. So we've touched on a few of them already. Physical space. So you mentioned whether the door is open or closed. There's a number of, for example, if you're sharing a space with a yoga studio, do they keep their straps hanging on the wall? Right. That is something that we might take down and not have in our visual space because, of trauma around being bound. Right. Space is one of the elements. The question of touch is a big one. Modifications, right? So how to make modifications to elements that you include. So we talked about scent being one of them, sound elements being another, just different things that we might, again, include because they feel good to us. They're of benefit. They feel like value to us. And it's just, again, releasing that attachment to the idea that that means it's going to be valuable for anybody. And so how to make modifications, how to offer modifications in a way that feels natural and gives people a way to accept or reject them in a way that doesn't make them feel weird about that, right? Normalizing it. Personal practice, as I said, is the very first one, right? So the first principle being, be true to your own practice. Reiki is first and foremost a self-practice. And there's a number of reasons related to trauma-informed practice that's important. So that's a handful of them. That's about half.
Beautiful. I love it. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it sounds like the majority of this would be absolutely applicable, even if you had a primarily distance Reiki practice as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot. So we talk about distance specifically. And so some of these, like touch, for example, is not applicable, but modification certainly is. Physical space certainly is, right? How, like if we're doing a session on Zoom, what are people seeing in our space? How have we invited them to set up their space? That's certainly applicable. All of the things around the mindsets around them being the expert of their own experience, healing coming from them, not something that we're giving them, doing to them. It's something that is generated from within. That, of course, is applicable in a distance session. So yeah, there's, things that are more and less applicable. There's things that are special to a distance session that we want to take into account. And again, all of it comes down to the degree to which we're offering them choice. We're asking them for consent for everything that they experience. And we're building a sense of trust and safety in doing that.
Absolutely, because that's how we empower our clients. Absolutely. I love it. So what's the deets? When is your class coming up? How long is it? All of those things.
Yeah, so it's on Saturday, June 4th. It is 6 hours broken into 2 3-hour sessions with an hour lunch break in between. So I think we have it scheduled for 10 to 1 Pacific time and then 2 to 5 Pacific time. It will be recorded, so folks can't make some or all of that. I have a number of students in Australia and in the UK, and so the time, gets a little wonky for them. So all of it's recorded. And for those who can't make it in person, I kind of make an extra invitation to follow up for a conversation if they need a little bit of processing or support around that. The workbook gets emailed out to folks ahead of time, so you can start working with that if you like. And yeah, I think those are the deets.
I love it. When are you going to turn that workbook into like a book that we can buy?
That is the question. It's so this is something I've worked on for almost 2 years now, and many years before that, if you just include the like ruminating on it, but actively developing for about 1.5 years. And it's so affirming and validating to hear people ask that question. A number of people have asked me that, and to hear so many people share like, yeah, I had this experience I didn't understand, and now I can see, I can understand it, and I know how to respond next time. So it's so affirming. And so yeah, I am looking at the possibility of I've never published a book before, so I'm in the like, how do you do that stage, and asking some friends. Luckily our community is ripe with people who have published books, so yes, there's a lot of really great support and learning here.
I love it. Well, I do truly believe that this is a topic that all Reiki practitioners who have a practice need. And so if you haven't heard of the topic of trauma informed before, if this is a new concept, I strongly advise that you check out Michaela's class, because we all need it. We need it for ourselves, and we need it for our communities if we're going to be masterful practitioners. That this is a really great complementary awareness that needs to be fully integrated into our practices. I really do believe that. So thank you so much for bringing all of your wisdom and sharing with us today on this podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, listeners out there, feel free to write a review for Reiki Cafe Radio. We do love those. And check out Michaela's website, which is, let me know.
It's heartscapesinsight.com. And then I also do have a YouTube channel, HeartScapes Reiki, that where I talk about a lot of these issues, and kind of have an ongoing dialogue going. There's always questions that come up, and pushback. There's quite a bit of can be a really challenging topic, and there's often folks who respond in a way that requires a little bit more conversation, particularly around the topic of fear, which is one that I'll be addressing in a video coming up. So yeah, that's another way to stay in contact.
Absolutely. I love it. Is there any other last minute words of wisdom or ways to contact you that you would like to share before we end our call?
Yeah, I think I'd love to just briefly touch on that topic of fear if I can, because this came up recently when I was, sharing about this topic, and someone said, it really, thinking about this idea of triggering trauma or causing harm in my Reiki practice, brings up a lot of fear. And I've been criticized as somebody who fear mongers by saying, hey, there's harm that can happen if we don't take care of certain things. And I want to say that I completely understand that perspective. It's partly why I kept silent about this for a really long time, because I don't want to initiate fear in other people. But what I've ultimately found is that in my practice, I was living with much more fear by having experiences that I didn't understand, and that I had no context, and I had no one to talk to about having those experiences in Reiki sessions. And not understanding them. I was living in much more fear inside of my practice. In fact, it almost shut me down from practicing at all. And when I have empowered myself with knowledge, with mindset changes, and with specific practices that I can consistently offer to my clients across the board, I don't have to know what's going on for them to offer these options, that I am living in much less fear in my practice. I'm feeling much more bold. I'm feeling much more relaxed and confident, and my clients are having better experiences. So I just wanted to address that if you're feeling triggered, if you're feeling like there's a sense of this is a scary topic that you'd rather just avoid, that you'd maybe rather I didn't bring up at all, I just want to assure you that on the other side of learning and on the other side of experience, there's tremendous freedom. And so I just really offer you to lean into just for today, I worry not. And let's talk about this. Let's have this conversation.
Yes. Awareness is always the first step in healing, and our practices need healing. The structure of the Reiki industry and what we do needs healing. So thank you so much for bringing this topic to our awareness so that we can start that healing as a practice. So thank you so much for coming on, and I hope to have you on again soon in the future for other topics that we can dive into. That
So many good topics.
so many good topics. So thank you. I so appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Christine. It's been great.